My name is Nadia Calloway. I'm 34 years old. And on the night my sister Brianna was wheeled through the emergency room doors on a gurney, the attending physician who walked in to save her life was me. My mother grabbed my father's arm so hard when she saw my face that she left bruises on his skin. I know because he showed me afterward, still shaking, still pale. I didn't hesitate. I didn't make her wait. I didn't say a single word about the 5 years they spent pretending I didn't exist. I just did my job. But before I tell you what happened in that ER, before I tell you what my mother said when she finally understood what I'd become without her, I need to take you back to the night it all started. A Tuesday in October, 5 years ago, when my sister picked up her phone and made a single phone call that she calculated, with precision, would erase me from our family. She didn't think I'd survive it. She was wrong. Before I ask you to keep watching, I want to say something. If you've ever been lied about by someone you loved, if you've ever watched your own family choose a version of you that wasn't true, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. And if this story is already hitting close to home, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Now let me take you back to where this started. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the older of 2 daughters. My father, Raymond, ran a mid-sized landscaping company he'd built himself over 20 years. My mother, Carolyn, was a dental hygienist, precise and careful in everything she did. The way people who measure things for a living tend to be about everything. Brianna is 2 years younger than me. She was, from the very beginning, the one who made things easier for our parents to love. That's not a complaint. It's just the truth. She had a way of making every room feel lighter, a laugh that arrived before her sentences did, the kind of easy warmth that adults mistake for goodness. I was quieter, more serious. I read textbooks for fun. I asked questions at dinner that made my parents shift uncomfortably in their seats. Why do we park in driveways and drive on parkways? Why does our church say one thing and our government do another? I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was just trying to understand the world. Brianna learned early that understanding the world was less important than making it comfortable for the people in front of you. I started pre-med at Ohio State at 18. The plan had always been medicine. I'd wanted to be a doctor since I was 9 years old, sitting in a waiting room with my grandmother while she got her blood pressure checked, watching the way the doctor spoke to her, like she was the most important person in any room she'd ever entered. I wanted to do that. I wanted to be that. My parents were proud, the kind of proud that requires an audience. Raymond told every client, every neighbor, every person who came to his booth at the church fair, "My daughter's going to be a doctor." Carolyn framed my acceptance letter and put it in the hallway. Brianna, for her part, studied communications at a smaller school 20 minutes from home. She was fine with that, she said. She was happy for me, she said. She was lying. I didn't know it then. But the jealousy had already started its slow leak under the surface, the way water finds cracks in a foundation before anyone notices the damage. The first sign came in my sophomore year. I'd come home for winter break thinner than usual, dark circles, the specific hollow look of someone who'd been running on caffeine and determination for 4 months straight. Organic chemistry had been brutal. I'd passed, barely, with a grade I wasn't proud of. I mentioned it over dinner, said I'd had a rough semester, that I was going to need to study differently going forward. Brianna glanced across the table at my mother. It was such a small thing, a half-second exchange, just a look, but I caught it. And I filed it away somewhere I didn't examine closely enough. By junior year, I was pulling solid grades. I'd found my footing, found a study group, found the method that worked for my brain. I was volunteering in the hospital system on weekends, shadowing physicians, writing research papers. I was building the record that would eventually get me into one of the best medical schools in the state. Brianna had graduated by then and taken a job at a marketing firm downtown. She was living at home, saving money, which made her present at every family dinner, every phone call, every quiet conversation my parents had in the kitchen after they thought we were asleep. I was not present. I was 112 miles away, in a library, becoming a doctor. The call happened on a Tuesday in October during my first year of medical school. I was in the middle of anatomy lab. My phone was off. When I turned it back on at 6 that evening, I had 11 missed calls. 3 from my mother, 4 from my father, 2 from my Aunt Rita, 1 from our pastor, of all people, and 1 from Brianna, which I noticed because she never called me. We communicated entirely by text in those days. I called my mother back first. She picked up on the first ring, which told me something was already wrong. Nadia. Her voice was different. Controlled but loaded, the way she sounded when she was trying to remain composed while feeling something very large. "We need to talk about what's happening at school." I was confused. "What do you mean?" "Nothing's happening. I had a good week, actually." A pause. Long enough that I started mentally cataloging what it could be. Had someone called them? Had there been an error in my records? Had I missed a required form? "Brianna told us," Mom said. "She said you've been calling her, crying. She said you told her you can't do it anymore, that you've already been to the dean's office to start the withdrawal process." I stood very still in that hallway outside the anatomy lab. I said slowly, those words one at a time, "That is not true." "Nadia." Her tone shifted into something I recognized. The careful, weighted voice she used when she believed she was navigating around someone's denial. Brianna wouldn't make something like this up. She was very upset when she called us. She was crying. "I'm telling you," I said, and I could hear my own voice getting quieter in the way it does when I'm trying very hard not to lose my composure. "I have not called Brianna crying. I have not been to the dean's office. I am not withdrawing. I am standing outside my anatomy lab, where I was 3 hours ago, and I'm going to be there again tomorrow morning at 7. Another pause. "She said you'd say that," Mom said, and that was the sentence that changed everything. "She said you'd say that." Because in those 5 words, my mother told me something I didn't fully understand yet. She had already decided. Not when she picked up the phone, not in the conversation, but before she called me, before she heard my voice. She had decided to believe my sister, and every word I said from that moment forward would be filtered through that decision like light through colored glass. Before I tell you what happened in the days that followed, I need you to understand something about Brianna that I only put together much later, after years of distance gave me the perspective I couldn't have in the middle of it. My sister wasn't cruel in the way movies show cruel people being cruel. She didn't twirl a metaphorical villain's cape. She was something more complicated, and honestly, more dangerous than that. She was the kind of person who believed her own revised versions of reality. By the time she told my parents I was dropping out of medical school, I think she told herself a story in which she was helping me, in which my success was somehow taking something from her that she deserved, in which my absence from the family was a wound she was tending, not a wound she'd made. She had been telling smaller lies for years. I just hadn't noticed them. Misremembered conversations. Events she recounted with details subtly shifted in her favor. Nothing big enough to call out. Nothing concrete enough to argue about. Just a slow, steady rewriting of shared history, done with such a light touch that it felt like misunderstanding rather than manipulation, until it wasn't small anymore. The conversation with my father was worse. Raymond Calloway is not a complicated man. He's warm, he's hardworking, he's loyal to a fault, and that loyalty, that beautiful, uncomplicated loyalty, was the very thing Brianna knew how to aim at. "Dad," I said when he got on the phone, "Brianna made this up. I don't know why, but she made it up. I'm not leaving medical school. I'm doing well. Please, you have to believe me." His voice, when he answered, was something I'd never heard from him before. Flat, careful, like he was choosing each word with both hands. "Nadia, Your sister was devastated. She called your mother in tears. She said she's been worried about you for months. I pressed my forehead against the cool wall of that hallway and breathed. She has no reason to lie about something like this. Dad, people don't just make up something like this. They do, I said. She did. Silence. I think you need to come home, he said finally. We need to sit down as a family and figure out what's going on. I told him I would. I told him I'd drive home that weekend. I told him we'd sit at the table together, the four of us, and I would show them everything. My enrollment confirmation, my grades, my schedule, my clinical rotation assignments, every piece of paper that proved I was exactly where I said I was, doing exactly what I said I was doing. Brianna was not home when I arrived. She had, I learned, told my parents she was too upset to be there, that seeing me right now would be too hard, that she needed some space to process her worry about me. The performance was masterful. I laid every document on the kitchen table: enrollment verification, transcript with my current grades, a letter from my faculty advisor praising my progress, photos on my phone of my hospital badge, my locker in the student facility, my name on the anatomy lab sign-in sheet from the day my mother had called me. My mother looked at each paper. She picked them up and set them down. She looked at them the way people look at things when they're trying very hard to find a reason not to believe what they're seeing. These could be forged, she said. I stared at her. She immediately softened. I don't mean that. I don't mean you forged them. I just mean... Brianna seemed so sure. She was sobbing, Nadia. I've never heard her like that. And I've never lied to you, I said. The table was quiet. Dad cleared his throat. Maybe you and Brianna just got your wires crossed. Maybe she misunderstood something you said when you were having a hard week. I hadn't called her. I hadn't said anything to cross. There were no wires to get crossed because there was no conversation. But I could see it already. The exit ramp they were building in real time. The way they were trying to reshape what had happened into something survivable, something that let them stay comfortable, something that didn't require them to look at their younger daughter and see what I was seeing. I drove back to Columbus that Sunday night knowing something had broken. I just didn't know yet how thoroughly. The cutoff came gradually and then all at once, the way those things always do. Phone calls stopped being answered. Texts went days without responses. When I called to tell them I'd been accepted into my first clinical rotation, my mother said, "That's nice, honey," and then said she had to go because Brianna was coming over for dinner. I was not invited. Thanksgiving that year, I called to ask what time I should arrive. My mother paused in a way that told me everything before she said a word. She said they were doing a small thing this year, just immediate family. I said I was immediate family. She said she meant the people who were, and then she stopped, and then she said they needed some time, that things were still raw, that they hoped I understood. I did not understand. But I understood what was happening. By my second year of medical school, I had been effectively excommunicated. No Christmas, no Easter. My birthday passed without a call. My Aunt Rita, who had always been warmer toward me, sent a card with a $20 bill tucked inside it and a note that said simply, "I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening in this family, but I'm sorry. I kept that card. I still have it. I want to be honest with you about what those years were like, because I think sometimes in stories like this, the person who's been wronged is painted as a hero who rose above everything cleanly, gracefully, without breaking. That was not my experience. I broke. Quietly, privately, in ways that I didn't let anyone see because I was in a professional environment that required me to be composed. I cried in parking garages. I sat with my phone in my hand on holidays, drafting messages to my mother that I never sent. I had a therapist I saw every 2 weeks who helped me understand that grief can exist even when the person you're grieving hasn't died. That being cut off by your own family is a specific, particular kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name in our cultural vocabulary. My therapist's name was Dr. Paula Owens. She was calm and patient and direct, and she told me something in our third session that I've carried ever since. She said, "You cannot control what your parents choose to believe. You can only control what you build with the time they've handed back to you." So I built. I finished medical school. I matched into an emergency medicine residency at a hospital back in Ohio, not Columbus, a larger hospital in Cleveland, close enough to home that part of me must have hoped it meant something. I completed my residency. I was good at it. I was, according to my program director, exceptionally good at it. Emergency medicine suited the way my brain worked. The speed of it, the problem solving, the fact that every shift was different, the fact that you had to be present with absolute completeness because lives depended on it. I didn't have time, when I was working, to think about what my family was or wasn't doing. That was, I realized later, part of why I was so drawn to it. I got married during my third year of residency. His name is Jonah. He's a radiologist. We met during a consult where I was advocating loudly for a patient, and he was trying to explain imaging results to me over a terrible phone connection. He said later, he fell in love with me, somewhere between the second time I said, "Say that again more clearly," and the third time I said, "I'll wait." My parents were not at our wedding. I sent them an invitation because Jonah asked me to. He has a quiet belief in giving people chances that I am still, to this day, learning from. I sent it with no expectation, and received confirmation of that low expectation when my mother called 2 days before the ceremony to say they didn't think they'd be able to make it. She said something about a prior commitment. I didn't ask what it was. I said, "Okay, Mom," and I hung up, and I went and put on the most beautiful dress I'd ever worn and married the kindest man I'd ever known in front of 60 people who actually showed up. Brianna sent a gift, a set of kitchen towels with a card that said, "Congratulations," and had her name signed alone, like she was an acquaintance at the office, not my sister. I donated the kitchen towels to the hospital break room. By the time I'd been an attending physician for 2 years, I'd stopped actively waiting for something to change. Not because I stopped caring, but because carrying the constant expectation of a call that never came was a weight that was interfering with my ability to be fully present in my life. I still thought about them. Holidays were hard. Jonah's family was wonderful, warm and chaotic and completely willing to adopt me without ceremony. But there is something about watching your husband's mother hug him that opens a particular door in your chest, and I learned to feel it and close it again and keep moving. That was the life I was living when the night happened. It was a Thursday. I was midway through a 12-hour shift, a busy one, the kind of shift that doesn't stop long enough for you to sit down. A trauma came in through ambulance bay, 2 at 9:47 p.m. Female, 32, suspected internal bleeding following a fall. Unconscious on arrival. Vitals unstable. I was the attending on call. I walked through the trauma bay doors pulling on gloves and looking at the gurney and the face on the gurney at the same time. And for one full second, my brain simply refused to process what it was seeing. Because the face was Brianna's. She was gray, the particular ashen quality of someone whose blood pressure has dropped below the point where their skin can hold its color. There was a laceration on her temple. Her breathing was shallow. The paramedics were talking, and I was hearing the words and cataloging them with the part of my brain that never stops working, the part that trained for exactly this. But underneath all of that, there was another part of me that was doing something entirely different, something that felt like falling. Then I heard my mother's voice. She and my father had apparently followed the ambulance in their car. They were at the edge of the trauma bay, the place family members stand when they're not supposed to be in the room, but have pushed through anyway. My mother was saying something to the nurse at the door, something about her daughter, something urgent, and then she turned to look into the room and she saw me. The sound she made was not a word. My father grabbed her arm to steady her. I looked at them for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds that contained 5 years of silence and an unanswered invitation and a kitchen table covered in documents they'd chosen not to believe, and a set of kitchen towels donated to a break room. Then I looked back at my sister. I started working. I need you to understand something about emergency medicine before I tell you the rest. When you walk into a trauma bay, you leave everything outside the door. Not because you're made of stone, not because you don't feel things, but because the person on that gurney is someone's world, and they deserve every single piece of you. Every year you spent in a library instead of at a Christmas dinner. Every hour of residency. Every skill you built in the time your family handed back to you. Brianna had a ruptured spleen. The fall had caused more internal damage than was immediately apparent. She needed surgery, and she needed it quickly. I stabilized her, got her blood pressure to a workable level, ordered the imaging that confirmed what I suspected, and had the surgical team paged within 11 minutes of her arrival. My mother watched all of this from the doorway. I went to them when Brianna was on her way to the OR. I stood in front of my parents in a hospital hallway, under fluorescent lights with blood on my gloves that I had not yet had the chance to change, and I looked at two people I hadn't seen in 5 years. They both looked older. My father's hair had gone fully gray. My mother had lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "She's going to surgery now," I said. "The surgical team is excellent. She's stable. Someone will come find you when she's out." My mother's mouth was open. She was looking at me the way you look at something when your mind refuses to finish processing what your eyes are seeing. "Your father's arm," I said, because I could see the marks from across the hallway. "Looks like it might bruise. Get some ice on that from the nurse's station." Then I went back to work. Brianna was in surgery for 3 hours. I was not her surgeon. I kept working my shift. I checked in twice through channels, the way any attending would check on any patient, and was told both times that things were proceeding well. At 2 a.m, I was charting in the physician's workroom when my mother knocked on the open door. I looked up. She was alone. She'd left my father in the surgical waiting room, she told me later, because she needed to do this alone. She stood in the doorway of that small, cluttered room with its bad overhead lighting and its whiteboards covered in patient codes, and she looked at me the way I had never once in my life seen her look at me, like I was someone she was meeting for the first time. "Nadia," she said. And then she stopped. I waited. I watched her face do something complicated, something that involved all of the muscles around her eyes and her jaw and the set of her shoulders. Something that looked, when it finished, like a person setting down a very heavy bag they had been carrying for a very long time. She told me afterward that she had known, not immediately, not right away, but that within 6 months of cutting me off, something had started pulling at her, a thread of doubt she'd tried to ignore. She'd asked Brianna questions, small ones, testing. Brianna's answers had been smooth and consistent, and perfectly arranged, but there were things that didn't quite line up, a detail here that contradicted something there. My mother was, after all, a precise and careful person by nature. She measured things for a living. The measurements had not been adding up, and she had been choosing not to look at them clearly for 5 years. She didn't tell me this in the doorway. She told me later. In the doorway, she just said, "You saved her life." "I saved her life," I agreed. "And she's your sister," my mother said. "She hurt you, and you saved her life." "Yes." There was a long silence. "I didn't do it for you," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I did it because it's my job and because she's a human being who needed a doctor. I would have done it for anyone." My mother nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I think that's what's making me feel the way I'm feeling right now." I asked her what she was feeling. She said, ashamed, "I'm going to pause here for a moment because I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to be the bigger person in a situation you never should have been put in? Have you ever done the right thing for someone who didn't deserve it and felt all of those feelings at the same time?" Drop a yes in the comments. And if you're still watching, still with me, please hit subscribe. There are more stories here, and I want you to find them. Now, back to that hospital. back to 2 in the morning, back to the conversation I had been both dreading and somewhere deep and secret, hoping for. Brianna's surgery went well. She was moved to recovery by 3 a.m. and would spend 4 days in the hospital before going home. She would make a full recovery. I visited her once the following afternoon on my day off. Jonah came with me. He held my hand in the elevator and said, "You don't have to go in." I said, "I know." I went in anyway. Brianna looked small in the hospital bed. The monitors beeped softly. Her color had returned, that ashy gray completely replaced by something closer to normal. She was awake. She looked at me and immediately started to cry. Not the performed, calculated crying I remembered from childhood. This was different. Ragged, uncontrolled. The crying of someone who has been lying to themselves for so long that finally stopping feels like breaking. I sat in the chair beside her bed and I waited. She talked for a long time. She talked about the jealousy she'd felt since we were children. The way my ambition had made her feel like she was always behind in a race she hadn't agreed to run. She talked about how proud my parents had been of me and how invisible that had made her feel, not because they didn't love her, but because their love for me had a quality of certainty that theirs for her never quite matched, and she'd spent years trying to fix that by any means she could find. She talked about that Tuesday in October, the phone call, and how she had told herself in the moment that she was helping, that I was struggling, and she was bringing the family together to support me, but how even as she was saying the words, even while the phone was still warm in her hand, she'd known. She'd known she was lying and she'd done it anyway, and she'd spent 5 years building a story around it that let her live with herself. She said she was sorry. She said it many times. I believed her, not because the apology undid anything, but because I could hear the difference between a person performing remorse and a person sitting in it without anywhere comfortable to go. She had nowhere comfortable to go anymore. The lie had done its damage and then turned on her. I said, "I forgive you for my own peace, not yours." I said it the way I'd learned to say it, clearly and without cruelty, because it was true. I had done a great deal of work in therapy on the question of forgiveness, and what I'd learned was that forgiveness is not the same as trust, and it is not the same as reconciliation, and it does not require the person who wronged you to deserve it. You forgive because carrying the weight of justified anger indefinitely is a cost that comes out of your own life, not theirs. I told her I didn't know what a relationship between us would look like going forward. That I wasn't closing the door, but I wasn't opening it all the way either. That she would need to do a great deal of work to rebuild anything, and that whether she did, it was her choice. She nodded and cried and said she understood. Jonah squeezed my hand when we walked out. The harder conversation was with my parents. Not because they were less sorry. They were genuinely devastated, in the particular way that people are devastated when they realize the mistake they made was not a mistake of circumstance or confusion, but a mistake of character. They had chosen comfort over truth. They had chosen their easier daughter over their more complicated one. They had allowed themselves to believe something because disbelieving it would have cost them something they didn't want to pay. My father cried. Raymond Calloway, who I had never once seen cry in 34 years of being his daughter, sat at the table in the hospital family room and put his face in his hands and cried. My mother was quieter. Her grief was more internal, the kind that comes from a person who has been sitting with something, uncomfortable for a long time, and is finally allowing it to be fully visible. She told me about the thread of doubt she hadn't examined closely enough. She told me she'd replayed that kitchen table conversation, the one with all my documents laid out in front of her, more times than she could count. She told me she'd known, somewhere beneath the surface, and she'd chosen not to look. I didn't tell her that was the worst part. I didn't have to. She already knew. What I told her was that I wasn't interested in punishing them. That I'd spent 5 years building a life that was full and meaningful and real, a life I was proud of, and that I wasn't going to spend the next 5 years dismantling it to assign blame. But I also wasn't willing to pretend, I wasn't willing to walk back into the family as though nothing had happened, to laugh at holiday dinners and let the silence cover everything like a cloth over old furniture. If we were going to have a relationship, I said, it had to be honest. It had to acknowledge what happened. It had to make room for the fact that I was not the daughter they'd imagined me to be, or the one they'd been told about. I was the one sitting in front of them, who had gone to school and graduated and done her residency and gotten married without them and built something real. My mother looked at Jonah when I said that. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "He seems like a good man." "He is," I said. "You would have known that 5 years ago if you'd been at our wedding." She flinched, but she didn't look away. It's been 4 months since that night. My parents and I talk on the phone twice a week. It's cautious and sometimes awkward, and occasionally, underneath the awkwardness, something that feels almost like what it could have been if it had been allowed to grow normally all those years ago. We are building something. Slowly. With both hands, paying attention. My father came to the hospital and asked to see where I worked. I took him through the department on a quiet afternoon, showed him the trauma bays, the monitoring systems, the whole complicated machinery of the place where I spend my working hours. He was very quiet for most of it. When we were leaving, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I am so proud of you." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I know, Dad. I've been waiting to hear that for a long time." He didn't let go of my shoulder. My relationship with Brianna is different, and will probably always be different. We text occasionally. Short, careful messages. She's in therapy now. Real therapy with a professional she sees weekly. And while I have no obligation to track her progress or celebrate it, I'll say simply that I notice it. She's doing the work. Whether that eventually builds into something I can call a sisterhood, I genuinely don't know. That bridge, if it gets rebuilt, will be built plank by plank, and we are still on the first plank. What I know is this: I became a doctor without them. I married someone wonderful without them. I built a life that has texture and purpose and meaning without them, and none of that is diminished by the fact that they're starting, slowly, to come back in. Dr. Paula Owens, my therapist, told me once that surviving something is not the same as being defined by it, that the goal isn't to become a person who was wronged and then overcame it. The goal is to become a person, fully, with all the complexity that entails, and to let the thing that happened be one part of that person and not the whole. I'm still working on that, but I'm working on it with good tools, a good partner, and a job that reminds me every single shift that life is both more fragile and more resilient than we tend to believe. I stood in a trauma bay 11 months after finishing my residency, and I saved my sister's life. The same sister who told a lie that cost me 5 years of my family. I didn't hesitate. I didn't make her wait. I didn't ask her to earn it. I did it because that's who I am. And I've realized, slowly, that being that person is not something that was built in spite of what happened to me. It was built with it. With every night I studied alone instead of going home for holidays. Every shift I worked when other residents were with their families. Every moment I chose to keep going when the easier thing would have been to let the grief make me into something smaller. They tried to erase me. It didn't work. You can't erase someone who is determined to take up space. If you are in a storm right now, if someone in your life has told a lie about you and been believed, if you have been cut off or pushed out or made to feel like you were too much or not enough, I want you to hear me say this clearly. The answer is not to make yourself smaller. The answer is not to wait for them to come back. The answer is to build something so real, so solid, so undeniably yours, that when they finally do come looking, what they find is not the version of you they imagined, but the version of you that you chose. Build that version. It will hold. Thank you for sitting with me through all of this. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel seen in some way, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And subscribe, because I have more of these stories, and they matter. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.